everyone, it's Janice, host of the Divorcing Religion podcast. Thanks for tuning into my show, whether you're joining me on audio or video. I've heard from some folks recently who have told me just how much the show has meant, and some of them have even found it not only to be life-changing, but life-saving, as they felt there was no one else who understood what they were going through, and they found the Divorcing Religion podcast, and they started feeling encouraged. Please help me keep my show on the air. Become a member by clicking the join button on the Conference on Religious Trauma YouTube channel. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious trauma recovery coach. And I'm so happy today to have my friend, Dr. Clint Heacock, join me again on the Divorcing Religion podcast. Clint was one of the first people to ever interview me about my own journey out of religion. Dr. Heacock is an ex-evangelical pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years. He grew up in the Church of Christ with parents who unfortunately bought into the Bill Gothard cult. After his deconversion, Clint started up his own podcast, which has been called Mind Shift. Fantastic podcast. He has used his show to raise awareness of the dangers posed by cults and high-control religious groups, to inform about the agenda of the Christian right and dominion theology, and to provide resources to those recovering from religious trauma syndrome. Welcome back, my friends. Good to see you again.
Thank you, Janice. Boy, after hearing that introduction, I'm like, you sure that's talking about me?
It's really you.
That's a lot.
That is, you've been a very busy fellow, that's for sure. And we were just getting caught up, and you're continuing on a learning curve now, kind of moving in another direction career-wise. And I know you're still very involved in the podcast world, and you're trying out some different names for the podcast, because Mind Shift has been used by a lot of different people. So that'll be exciting. You can keep me posted, and I'll make sure to update the show notes when you land on a name you like.
In fact, I just saw your comment on our Facebook group, but yeah, I've realized when I first started the show about 7 years ago, there was only a couple of Mind Shift podcasts out there, but for some reason, that's a great popular name, but there's a lot of different categories. There's one on education. There's a couple of ones by Christian pastors, churches.
Yeah.
So it's just, there's too many shows called Mind Shift podcasts. So I need to come up with something more distinctive, more, like yours is a great title. It says exactly what the show is about. Yeah, let's just put a shameless plug in there. But yeah, it's a great title. And I'm thinking I need something that's more clearly, relates to what I'm doing and that stands out from the crowd. So yeah, in the next month or two, I'm going to be releasing or rebranding, I guess you could say. Plus, I'm working with my good friend, Tim Sledge, where I've got a book that I've written.
Oh,
and I'm like 99.9% done with it. We're doing the chapter by chapter edits now. And so that's going to be coming out hopefully this summer.
Fantastic.
It's all about my backstory, like you mentioned, growing up, my family life, the Bill Gothard stuff, and how I was such a devoted Christian. I wanted to get it right, and I had rapture anxiety and religious trauma syndrome. I go through all that in the book.
Wow. Well, I'm excited to read your book, and my book is also supposed to be coming out this summer as well.
So we'll have to do some shows on each other's books.
For sure. Yeah, it really is amazing. I was just thinking this morning about even just in the last 4 years, the craziness that my life has been, and everybody else's, of course, with the pandemic thrown in there as well. And I bought a house, and I got married, and I had major surgery, and I launched my podcast and my YouTube channel and all these things. I'm like, oh my God, no wonder I'm tired. Because I'm trying to do so many things all the time. And of course, the Conference on Religious Trauma. Yeah, another shameless plug there. So
that's true.
That's how I know. That's right. That's how I know Tim Sledge, because you and Tim both spoke at the inaugural Conference on Religious Trauma. We had a panel of former clergy, and people really appreciated that and enjoyed that. I just loved him. He has such a gentle spirit. He really does. He just is like a kind, very intelligent person who has gone through all the steps of his own deconversion and was an evangelist as well. So you guys have a lot in common that way. And now with your podcast, I have so appreciated you, my friend, because the way you've shined a light and continue to on Christian nationalism, the rise of Seven Mountain and Dominion theology. People need to know about this stuff. It's terrifying what's going on in the United States right now.
It's true. And as you said, going back to, our stories, that's one of the funny things. You talk about divorcing religion, and yet my background is as an academic. I was a Bible college teacher. I taught in seminaries. I did a PhD, and all those skills that I learned weren't just, thrown in the dustbin. I learned how to be a researcher. I learned how to write academic papers. And so that is a skill that I put to use in my own podcast, because that's what I do. I'm an academic by trade. So even though I'm not teaching, theology anymore, like, Tim said the other day, I still speak the language. Theology is still a language that I can speak. And so I know the terms, I know what they're talking about because I taught it, I lived it for decades as a pastor, as a Bible college teacher. So it's not going to waste. And I think that's a good point for people who are maybe leaving religion. And I know you've talked about this before. It's like you can take the good, as it were, that you learned while you were in that religion or cult or whatever. It's not all complete rubbish. There's some good to be gleaned from that. It's hard to pick through the rubble. I think you can walk away and say, yeah, I've got some positive things that I learned out of that experience.
Right. Yeah. Even if it's, the things that we learn were like that we actually need boundaries. Boundaries are important because within the church, boundaries aren't acceptable. You're to be accessible all the time to God, to your pastor, to your groups that are trying to help keep you from sinning, all these sorts of things. So, I think if anything we've learned that's worth bringing forward into our new life, let's do it. And I saw this video the other day, and it was so cringy because it was a very Christian woman in Walmart somewhere in the United States, and she stopped and she's yelling to everyone by the cash registers. She doesn't work there; she's just a shopper. Can I have your attention, please? And then she launches into this talk about how it's Easter weekend and it's the resurrection, and you need Jesus and all this stuff. And I mean, I am just cringing. In Canada, I don't think that would happen. I think a security guard would usher the person out for creating a disturbance. But inside, I totally could relate because I remember marching inside a store in our local shopping mall here and shaking my finger at the manager saying that mannequin doesn't have enough clothes on. There's families here and just feeling so zealous in the righteous indignation, if I can use those terms. And I recognized it in that lady, even as I was, rolling my eyes and just feeling cringy, because she believed she was doing the right thing. And you can relate to that too, because at one time you 100% believed, and I'm sure would have given your life for the sake of spreading the gospel, because that's what we believed to be true at the time.
Exactly. I was an evangelist. I taught other people how to evangelize, how to proselytize. I went on mission trips to Mexico, Africa. I did all that. I didn't preach at a Walmart. But, we have a mutual friend, Dr. Marlene Winnell, and something she said is absolutely stuck with me. She said that religion is all pervasive. It affects every single area and aspect of our lives. And I've kind of made that my mantra because I realized everything that we did when we were in our religion, like we said, affected everything, every relationship, our sexuality, our outlook on life, our worldview, affected it in some way. And it made us different people, didn't it? And that poor woman, she's going into Walmart thinking, I've got to spread the good news to these people. And I'm compelled to do it. Preach the gospel at all times, in season and out of season, all these verses that come to mind.
Yeah. And it is a strange position to be in, to recognize that zeal and what's driving the people. And then, of course, on this side of things, to have seen the rise of QAnon, which is essentially a new cult, new religion, whatever. And of course, the whole Donald Trump thing, too. To see that in real time, taking off and taking flight, and seeing how utterly deluded people are. And the judges are sentencing January 6th insurgents to prison time. And I just was reading an account today, and the one guy was representing himself, and he said, well, I want the court to know that, I've had my sins forgiven by Jesus. He's saying this to the judge, as if it's going to make a difference. And I actually felt a little bit of compassion for the fellow, because I think it was, Trump knew how to get in and stoke that anger and fear and stir those sentiments of, you're being persecuted, they're coming for your religion, which certainly is not true by any stretch. But since Christians are already primed to expect persecution, because that's what it says in the Bible, they see it everywhere. And so I think that's what was motivating a lot of people to go out on January 6th. And now that guy's going to have 7 long years in prison to consider it.
It's so true. It's a cult, like you said, it's a political cult of personality. And the weird thing about QAnon, you mentioned, when I did a lot of research and I did a couple episodes on QAnon, one thing that struck me right away was that this is exactly what the satanic panic was. You probably lived through that back in the 80s, early 80s, early 90s. When I was an evangelical, I lived through the satanic panic, Mike Warnke, and underground satanic covens all over the place, and all these things were going on. And when I started researching QAnon, it struck me that it's like the satanic panic 2.0. So it's something that evangelicals are particularly susceptible to, these conspiracy theories. And like you said, then you throw in the Trump stuff and he's stoking it and all the rest of it, and you end up with January 6th. And now the real concern is, coming into the 2024 election, will there be violence around the election? And it seems that a lot of the signs point to the fact that, yes, no matter what the outcome is, whether Biden wins, Trump won't accept that. So his followers will rise up. If it's a tie, he won't accept a tie, so it's unless he wins, there won't be violence, so, and if he wins, we got a dictator.
Right. Yes. And of course, all of the lies in there that some Christian people have bought into, as far as the United States being founded as a Christian nation. I mean, it was founded because people were fleeing religion and religious persecution. And actually, some of them did want things to be more religious. This is the Puritans. But then even within the Puritans, they split apart because there were all these different groups who thought, oh, you're not holy enough and you're not holy enough. But really, the founding fathers were saying a big thumbs down to religion. They didn't want that to have a seat in running the country. That's my understanding of things as a Canadian. Is that accurate?
Well, yeah, I think there's a lot to be said there, but I think you're right. There was a small group of people, as you say, the Puritans. Now, what happens is people now, the Christian nationalists, are spreading the lie that America was founded as a Christian nation and all the rest of it. What they're doing is they're pulling from the Puritans. Now, when I researched the Puritans, guys like John Winthrop and other people, he was the first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, they did believe that America was going to be this shining light on the hill. They had a covenant theology, and so they saw themselves as the new Israel. They were going into the promised land, really, and that's the way they interpreted the Old Testament. They were like a modern-day Israel going into America. This was the promised land from which the gospel would shine to all the nations, as long as they obeyed the commands of God, just like the Old Testament Israel in the Hebrew Bible. So they did see it that way. But like you said, there was a lot of other groups, in there too, and they didn't always agree. And the funny thing is that there's no control. And that's the weird thing about when you look at the history, because they came here to establish religious freedom, there wasn't a controlling church. Like in Europe, we had the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church. In this country, and they didn't have any means of controlling, quote unquote, heresies. So anything goes. So who's to say which is right? If you say God spoke to me and told me this, well, no, that's not right. So there's all these groups that split and split and split, new religions, new groups, new cults that came up, and there's no control over it. And that's why you have what we have today in America. You got thousands of Christian denominations. Then you got like the Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Scientology, on and on and on. These are all homegrown American religions.
Yeah, and you touched on something there when you said God spoke to me, God told me this, gave me this revelation. The whole idea of the willing suspension of disbelief. So I'm going to set my critical thinking aside, my knowledge of physics, whatever aside, because I'm instead going to embrace this idea that miracles, can happen, and time can be stopped, and donkeys can talk, and axe heads can float, and whatever, all these things. But as soon as we do that for any type of religious group or ideology, we become vulnerable than to charlatans and to mentally ill persons who can come along, people who are deluded, and they will say, God told me this. They call themselves prophet or bishop or guru or whatever it is. God told me this, and you must obey. And it just sets us up for so much danger and so much damage. And this is a big part of what's going on in the United States right now. So we do have some people who would, call themselves Christian people, but who are much more moderate, and they might use the word progressive, and they just kind of love everybody and want everybody to have equal rights and equal value, but they also think Jesus is great. But then there are so many who just only stand on the Bible, and that's it. And there's not a lot of wiggle room in there. And these are the ones that believe they must be in charge. They must be in control. And I feel I'm scared that you guys are tumbling towards a theocracy or something similar there.
You're right, and that goes back even to the fundamentalist liberal debates back in the late 19th century, or like you were alluding to. There's always been a group of Christians who want to preserve this sort of hardline, orthodox theology, whatever you want to call it. And a lot of that strand, as you say, is what we see today. Evangelicals today are kind of second generation fundamentalists. They've kind of softened a little bit. Like you said, they aren't not necessarily that hard line like the fundamentalists were back in the early 1900s, but they were so militant. They were so angry, and they were fighting against liberal theology, and they were going to make a stand, and they had their little circle drawn around what was right and what was orthodox, and everybody else was heretical and going to hell. So you see that coming through even now. There's a lot of people out there who are, like you say, very strict in their interpretation of the Bible, and if you disagree with them, well, you're a heretic.
Yeah. Boy, oh boy. Like, where's the love, for sure. And so on your podcast, on Mindship Podcast, I've heard you talk about seven mountain theology, like the seven pillars that a certain segment of Christianity wants to control or have be take their space in regular life, life for people who aren't even Christians. I'm not sure what all those seven areas are. Do you happen to have them written down? Or I feel like entertainment was one, politics.
Yeah, well, basically, to take a little step back, what it is, it's a stream of what's called dominion theology. And I think you mentioned that earlier. Basically, to kind of simplify it, you've got two streams. This is something one of my friends, Frederick Clarkson, he writes for Political Research Associates. He was the first one to kind of identify what was going on in terms of dominion theology. And you've got this sort of hard, and then there's a more soft dominion theology. The hard dominion theology is where these kind of Christian Reconstructionists, people who really want to set up a government that's run by Old Testament laws, the Ten Commandments. And these guys are real serious about it. Now, there's more of a soft dominion theology, which is they're saying we'll work within the system. And that would be more of your Seven Mountains mandate. It's a form of dominion theology, and they're looking to take over by infiltrating all levels of government. And they say there's seven aspects or mountains of society. They would include family, religion, entertainment, media, arts and entertainment, business, and government. And the seductive part about the Seven Mountains stuff is that, they would say to the average person sitting in the pew in your typical church somewhere in any town in USA, look, you don't have to run for president. You're never going to be president. But what you need to do is you need to take over. Are you a business person? Are you a teacher? Are you whatever? You can take over that particular mountain. And that's what you need to do in your little sphere of influence. That's all you have to do. Run for your local school board. If you're a business person, take over the business mountain. Are you in entertainment or arts and media or whatever? Take over that mountain, and you will take dominion over your little area. And if we get enough people doing that, we'll take dominion over the whole nation. But we're working within the system. We're not trying to impose Old Testament law like the more hard dominion theology would say.
Wow. And I think there are a number of people who find that appalling, and they don't agree, and they don't want that to happen, but they maybe hesitate to say anything because they don't want to make people feel uncomfortable. So they're not, and I think just the opposite now. When I'm in conversation or a group situation and someone starts, pardon me, espousing very religious worldviews and ideas, I will say, I disagree. I am an atheist, I'm a secular humanist, and I see things very differently from that. And I see danger according to what you're promoting. And so I have to be prepared in that moment for things to feel a little bit uncomfortable. But otherwise, we leave people in their echo chamber, because they're not going to get pushback from their church community or from their pastors, and typically not even from their children if the children are being raised in a strict religious home. So people do need to hear from others that we don't all agree. And so we can focus on things that we do agree on. You know, we do love our families and want our families to be healthy and happy and have freedoms. So yeah, it's just so... I never would have guessed in it feels like a short period of time, but I know things have really been underway even since the 1950s to try and expand the reach of Christianity in the United States. And that's what we see coming to fruition today.
Exactly. I mean, you look at a case study, a guy like Billy Graham, he's a classic example. He started out as just your straight evangelist, holding tent revivals, and he gets bigger and bigger and bigger. He's holding crusades in stadiums, 50, 60, 70,000 or more people streaming forward to accept Christ back in the 1940s and the 50s. But then he starts to get involved in the political sector. He's the pastor to president, starting with, I think it was Truman, all the way through Obama. He was the spiritual advisor, the pastor, and he was one of the first people that kind of paved that groundwork, paved the way. Wait a minute, we could have a famous preacher, a pastor, advising these presidents on policies. And Billy Graham was the guy. And off the back of that, you get, of course, the Christian right, Jerry Falwell, the Moral Majority, and all these other groups that were started in the late 1970s and early 80s. And that's when the really big push started. They looked at Billy Graham and said, wait, we can get in the White House. We can have the ear of the president. We can inform the president on policy. And then I was going to say about your other comment, their argument is that a rising tide lifts all boats. They say, look, if as a Christian society, if we had Christians in charge running the show, everybody would benefit. You would benefit, Janice. I would benefit, even though you're an atheist. We'd all be better off. But that isn't true because, in a sense, look at America as a case study. They did win. When they got Trump elected as president, the evangelical vote, 81% in 2016, he appointed the last 3 Supreme Court justices. They then succeeded in overturning Roe versus Wade, which has been a long-term Christian right agenda for over 40 years. And look at what's happened. The state of Texas is now like a vigilante society where if you go get an abortion, someone can turn you in. It's become a Handmaid's Tale type situation. And you go, well, is that the kind of society that you want to live in? That's what happens when Christians get in charge. You end up with places like Calvin's Geneva. There are case studies in history where there have been theocracies, and they've been horrible places. You don't want to live in Calvin's Geneva. You really don't.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned The Handmaid's Tale, and I had the privilege to interview author Margaret Atwood, who wrote that book. I interviewed her just a few months ago, and she said that all the different cases kind of that she put in that book of terrible things that were done to people, they were all taken from real cases, real experiences around the world, typically in theocracies. And it just was mind-blowing. It's terrifying. Now, what about, I keep hearing about this program 2025, or is that even what it's called? Tell us a little bit more about that. Right, project, yeah.
This is something, I've got an episode coming out, a couple episodes. I spoke with Jenny Cohn, and she's been on my show before, and she writes for the Bucks County Beacon. She put an article out just the other day on Project 2025. There's been some talk around this thing, trying to shed light on it. What it is, it's a program that's run, it was started by something called the Heritage Foundation. Now, I've been digging into this. If anyone knows what the Heritage Foundation is, this was an organization that was founded in the early 1970s. One of the key founders was Paul Weyrich. And Paul Weyrich was also influential in helping Jerry Falwell form the Moral Majority in 1979. This guy was one of the major players in sort of Christian and far-right politics in the 70s and 80s. He helped found a number of organizations. So you've got the Heritage Foundation. They have been advising presidents with their agenda since Ronald Reagan. So every single president, certainly the Republican ones, have been listening to the Heritage Foundation and putting their policies into place. And they said when Donald Trump was the president, within the first year, he adopted 2/3 of the Heritage Foundation's mandates. Mm-hmm. So Trump was just installing, here's this playbook. They called it Mandate for Leadership. They put this out every time a new president is elected, and it's like a conservative handbook. They just handed it to Trump, and he just enacted like 2/3 of it within the first year of office. So,
wow.
He didn't even care. He didn't look at it. He was like, sure, that sounds great. So this is the organization that's behind Project 2025. What it is, it's called the Presidential Transition Project. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to mobilize people now to get a conservative president elected, which obviously would be Trump in the upcoming election. When he's elected, let's say Trump wins in November, by January 2025, they will hand him a playbook and they'll say, here's your first 180 days, sir, of all the policies you need to enact from day one for the next 180 days. And the other part of it is right now, they're training up essentially an army of new workers, like civil servants, who are going to work in the Trump organization. And they're already offering training courses and everything. So if you look at their website, they're not hiding anything. They're saying if you are interested in a career as a civil servant working for a conservative president, take our courses now, and then you'll be primed for when he is elected and takes office in January 2025, so you can slot right in. Wow. And they want to do all kinds of stuff. They want to ban pornography. They want to have mass roundup of immigrants and deport them all. It just goes down the line. They want to protect abortion rights and make it even more stringent. If you read their playbook, it's very chilling what they want to enforce within the first 180 days.
Right. And actually what they want to protect is they want to squash abortion rights. They don't want anyone to have the right to their, and pardon me, I know also that I've heard talk of banning birth control. Just the whole idea then of girls and women being nothing but baby makers, really. And that is very Handmaid's Tale type of stuff. And so do you get the feeling that more and more people are becoming aware of Project 2025?
Yes, I think that is slowly starting to filter out there. In fact, it was kind of a funny thing. They had their playbook on their website, and I believe they deleted it. They got rid of it because too many people were saying, whoa, hang on a minute. This is what these people actually want to enact on day one, starting day one, and they got rid of it. But luckily, people like Jenny Cohn and others, they've got it, they've archived it. So now it's there. In fact, I saw on X the other day, someone had put a PDF of it, a searchable PDF, so you could put in certain terms and it will find. So I spent about half an hour searching through this mandate, this sort of playbook, and I found some pretty chilling stuff. Talking about banning pornography. One of the things you mentioned, banning abortion, contraception, they even want to make it illegal to send, like, let's say there's an abortion pill through the mail. So that would become an illegal, you could go to prison for that. So let's say in a state like Texas where it is illegal, if you were in another state and you mailed someone in Texas an abortion pill, you could end up going to prison for that. That's how draconian they want to make this thing.
Wow. And I mean, as a woman, I know there are other women thinking, how could women be okay with this? How do women think that having Trump in office and having their own rights repealed is a good thing? But I can speak as a woman who was indoctrinated, brainwashed, and gaslit. There's a degree of gaslighting that goes on for women because we're told that men are higher than women. God created Adam first, and that women shouldn't be speaking, shouldn't be, making any kind of show of themselves. And so if you're fed that nonsense from the time you grow up, when you're a child, it does get in there. And I even remember there was a time that I stopped voting I wouldn't vote. Firstly, I thought, okay, well, Christians shouldn't be voting because I was moving more in the Anabaptist Mennonite direction. But then I was even thinking, well, can I really trust myself? Can I be trusted? Should I even be driving? Like, I remember having these thoughts that are just so offensive and ridiculous, but they absolutely grew out of what I was taught in church and Bible studies, and John MacArthur, all those types of men who were very keen on telling me as a woman what was right for me. And now it makes me sick to my stomach. I feel like women need to get out and vote en masse. We have got to let these politicians know that it's not okay, that they will try and control us and repeal our rights. We won't take it.
And I think we're seeing a backlash. And this is something I've just finished reading. This is a monstrous book. It took me, I read it on Audible, so that's kind of cheating, but it's Francis Fitzgerald's book. It's called The Evangelicals, The Struggle to Shape America. And it's really good. The problem with it is it ends several years ago, so before the Trump stuff, but she tells the story of the Christian right, and it goes through quite exhaustive detail. But, back in the 90s, there was a big backlash against the Christian right. And again, during the George W. Bush era, because that was before Trump, he was sort of the high watermark for evangelicals. They had the Republican House, the Congress, they were winning. They thought we're going to get all these policies enacted, but they couldn't get it done. But the ones they did get through, they got a huge public backlash. And we're seeing that now. Like you say, there's women out there who are pissed off about the abortion thing being overturned, Roe versus Wade. And there might be a giant backlash coming in the next election. We'll see. But the Christian right, they never seem to learn that lesson. They piss people off when they pull stuff like this, but they've been very clever about it. They've been doing this for a long time.
And when a cause becomes a holy cause, such as, the evangelicals thinking that they need to be in charge of all these things, it's impossible to reason that away, because it's not coming from a reasonable thinking, critical thinking part of the mind. It's really a lot of fear and misinformation and misbelief that's guiding people's actions and making them scared, or think that somehow doing this is going to usher in the next, Jesus will return or whatever it is. And people who grew up in America, they're used to hearing those things. But if you grew up in a Muslim country or a Buddhist country, you've heard other things from the time, or India. The stories you've grown up with are very different. The gods you've grown up with are different, and the ideas and concepts are very different. Geography really has a huge amount to do with what we believe and what seems normal to us.
And what religion we end up taking on, and especially if you're raised in it like I was. I don't know if you were raised in it from day one, but I was born into a church. I was born into a Christian family. I didn't even have any concept of other religions out there until I was much older. And that's where, like you were articulating, I think it started edging into the cult-like psychological tactics, because what you were describing earlier, that is the whole biblical patriarchy or Christian patriarchy, which is baked into the DNA of much of evangelicalism in America today. It's a highly patriarchal system. The churches are run by men. It's all about women must submit to men. That's what the Bible teaches. That's what Paul talks about in the book of Ephesians and in other places. And you get these pastors that telling women, there was one just the other day, I don't know if you saw this, but there's got some controversy around it. There was a marriage conference, quote unquote, somewhere, and this pastor was basically telling the women, look, on your wedding night, you just go where he tells you to go, stand where he tells you to stand, and do what he tells you to do on the, in the marriage bedroom, as it were. And he got all this applause. Well, now it's coming back on him. And I read an article today about it, and it was saying, this is the problem. Why were you getting applauded for that statement by women as well in the crowd? And he said, this is so baked into the DNA of evangelicalism, and it's set the stage for a guy like Trump. These Christians have been, decades and decades of this conditioning to accept men, a strong man leader, that here comes Trump, and he's just another one. And so, even a woman is going to accept it.
Right. Yes. And of course, that whole kind of cult mindset, the rigidity of thought, and the authoritarianism comes in there. And then, of course, we feel safer because we feel like someone's in charge, and we've been programmed from a young age to believe that we need to have someone, typically a man, in charge to keep us safe and to do things. And then we don't really have to think too much. We've got these very, very clear boundaries here that we can't go farther than. And then, I mean, people are just, they're rife for predatory behavior when that happens. Predators, they see the best places they can slip in and take charge and have people under their control. And a lot of times that's churches. We see it also in sporting with, some coaches and this sort of thing. But with patriarchy kind of running the show, women and children are in danger a lot of times, and they don't even see it. And then, of course, the insistence is that they forgive, and they're not allowed to gossip. So you're not allowed to talk about if something did happen, and the predator says, "Oh, you got to forgive me." So that's where I even have issues with the concept of forgiveness, because it can be weaponized by abusers. And I tell my clients recovering from religious trauma, acceptance is what we really need to get to. We want to be to a place where we're seeing things clearly. We can clearly see what happened, and that someone has abused us at some point. And then it's our choice how we want to move forward, whether or not we want to continue giving this person access to our life or not. But that's a very different way than the concept of forgiveness that most churches demand of congregants.
Well, the whole restoration thing. Well, he sinned or he made a mistake, but we'll go through a little restoration process and bring him back in. We saw this with Mark Driscoll in Mars Hill in Seattle. The only difference was Mark Driscoll refused to submit to the process, and he quit before any of that could happen. But yeah, you're right. These patriarchal structures are rife for abuse, because you get this man typically in charge. And in the Christian circles, he's a man of God. He's on this pedestal because he's kind of got a hotline to God. He's like the special anointed messianic figure. And then you plug in the evangelical purity culture stuff like you were articulating. Let's say a young girl's taught that, look, if you get abused by a man or a pastor, let's say, sexually assaulted, you led him astray. You were dressed provocatively. It's your fault. You did it. And he's got this raging libido he can't control. He's a raging, out of control animal, and it's your fault. You caused him to stumble. And so if she comes to her parents or some authority figure to say, this is what this guy did to me, a lot of times she won't be believed, first of all. And then secondly, how dare you touch not the Lord's anointed? How dare you bring this accusation against that man of God? And when he finally does maybe admit, or somehow it comes to light, there's this quick restoration process, and he's right back in, free to abuse yet again. We see it happening in the Catholic Church. How many times? Just move a priest to a new parish and then sweep the whole thing under the rug. He continues to abuse children. And then they move into the next parish and the next, there's this trail of victims.
It's unbelievable to me that the Catholic Church still exists, that it is still permitted to exist, that it has so much money when it has caused so much harm. It's just galling to me, very, very frustrating, very upsetting when we know that it's a hiding place for predators.
Sure.
Just so frustrating. I wish there was a way to get people to see the benefits of humanism, of being a humanist. You can see behind me, I have this poster, How Do You Live your Values? That. And it's the American Humanist Association, and it's the 10 commitments of humanism rather than the 10 commandments of Christianity, and just ways that we can contribute to the world to make the world a better place. Nothing to do with religion, nothing even to do with spirituality, but how can we help meet the needs of other people, and how can we help them learn to meet their own needs, just everybody having dignity and value. That resonates so strongly with me. But I remember being a Christian and hurling that as an insult. So-and-so is a secular humanist, Ooh, that's so bad. That's a terrible thing. Evil. That's right. And now humanism. I'm like, wow. Yeah. Now I'm the president of my local humanist association.
You've slipped for sure, Janice. You're on the way to hell. You used to have head coverings and everything. You were so right before,
Yeah,
It's amazing when we look back at the person we were, because I've said this before. Someone told me years ago, such great advice, said, if you want to see how far you've come, try to find someone who's never had any religious upbringing in their life, no connection with religion, and explain to them what you used to believe. And while you're doing that, carefully watch the look on their face. And as the shock and the disbelief, and that you believed that crap. Yes, I did. I was 100% all in. I had this happen to me. I was driving back when I was in the States a couple of years ago with my friend, Big Steve. He's like 6'8", massive guy, never been religious. And we had about a 3-hour drive. And I went through my whole backstory, and he was just in shock, and I thought, that's the point. Looking at the look on his face and his shock and the disbelief, they're like, my God, I used to believe all that stuff. I was 100% all in.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And then there's nothing quite like going to church every Sunday and youth group and Bible study and men's group and all these sorts of things.
You're in the bubble.
Yeah, you're in the bubble. And to everybody else, your story seems normal and it's even lauded. People, if you stand up and confess this terrible sin, your testimony, and people are crying like they just think it's the most wonderful thing ever. But to people who were never had the undue influence, as Steve Hassan says, exerted by religion, they don't get it. They're like, that is crazy. That is totally nuts. But it doesn't seem nuts when you're raised that way and everybody believes it. It seems like the truth.
Well, and this is something we talked about. Tim Sledge, our good friend, and he has a book called Breaking the Spell of Christian Belief. And that's exactly what he describes as being under the influence of a spell. You're like in this dream state. You're doing everything. It is you. But when you then wake up and realize I'm getting out of this thing, and you look back on it, you're like, my God, who was that person? I was like the dream state, a dream walking thing. It's really strange. I look back on the person I was, and my girlfriend says it all the time. I can't believe that was you, Yeah. And when something happened, like we were mentioning at the top of the show, like the changes to my career and changing jobs and buying a house, I would have been praying and seeking the Bible and talking to pastors and other Christians about the will of God. And it's markedly different now. I'm just making decisions as things come up. I try to make the best, most informed decision. I get advice. I talk to other people. But at the end of the day, I'm not praying. I'm not reading the Bible. And I'm not doing that anymore. But I was telling her the other day, that's what I would have been doing right now. Oh, God, what do you want me to do? Is this your will? And I need to be, I got to be in your will, because if I'm not, I could be in real trouble here. Those thoughts don't trouble me at all.
Wow. And then we put ourselves in danger because we are believing that God will give us some sort of sign. And then we're looking for, and we'll take anything as a sign, or even just a stranger might say a phrase to us or whatever. And we take that to be a sign from God. Yeah. And then it might totally upend our life or have us do something that's unsafe. I think of this young man who within the last couple of years was determined he was going to this island that had never been reached with the gospel. And even India had put rules and laws in place to protect the inhabitants of the island. Nobody was allowed to go there and interfere with this tribe. This young man was a missionary, and he decided he was going to go there. He didn't speak the language, I'm not thinking, but anyway, God was maybe going to do a miracle. And he had tried to go 3 times. And so the third time, unscrupulous people did take his money and drop him up there. And sure enough, he was killed. And so Christians would see him as a martyr. They would celebrate him, I'm sure. And I look at it and go, oh my God, like colonialism and missionary stuff is absolutely one and the same. It's tied right in there. He could have been introducing them to all sorts of illness and disease that they can't cope with because they haven't had interactions with outsiders. But also how galling to decide that you know best what those people need.
Mhm.
But I'm sure, yeah, and it is a tragedy. It's very sad that he lost his life. But I think the greater tragedy is that Christians won't learn from it as long as they're under the influence. They think
Mhm.
they're doing the right thing. They think they're doing what God commands them. Jesus commands us to go. And so that's what they're doing. And as long as they remain inside and under the influence, they won't get it. And
Mhm.
they won't, even when you're talking, and like I said, trying to reason with them, for a lot of them, it won't. They have to be in the right frame of mind to be ready to connect those dots.
Mhm. Yeah, that's true. The cognitive dissonance, sometimes it can be it just becomes too much. And that's the hope, isn't it? As Yonda Lalit, she says it's the mental shelf. You put all the questions and doubts and concerns on this mental shelf in the back of your mind. Eventually, for some people, the weight becomes too much, the cognitive dissonance, and the shelf collapses. And then you're like, oh my God, what do I do now? Because I can't live with this. And I look back on my time as an evangelical, and I had real specific moments of doubt and concerns and questions about my faith. But I was able to navigate through those. I put them on the shelf, and the shelf was strong enough. It held, for a number of years. But then eventually it finally collapsed, and I had nowhere to turn other than to say, I don't believe any of this anymore. And now what? This is my whole life, my whole adult life. I was a Bible college teacher. I was a pastor. I did all that stuff. I was in Bible college and seminary. I spent thousands, tens of thousands of dollars and
Yeah.
pounds coming to this country to get a PhD. Was it all a waste? Well, you got to, like we said before, you got to salvage what was positive out of it. For me, it's the academic side of it and what I learned in the process. The person that I became, that's who I am now.
Yes. I'm so grateful. I'm so
Mm.
grateful you are who you are now. And I think I definitely know people and have interacted with people for whom their religious identity was everything. I would put myself in that,
Sure.
same zone. My identity and my ideology were fused, which made it all the more painful trying to extricate and figure out. And I know a number of people who ended up having to go inpatient, spend time in mental health facilities because their whole life, as they knew it, evaporated when they put that one key into the lock and figured out, oh my God, I've been taking a book literally that was not meant to be taken literally. It's
Mm-hmm.
mythology, like it's an idea. Jesus is an idea that's kind of been around for a long, long time and shows up in different iterations in different mythologies and religions. And when we learn that, it can be like that massive tsunami that hit on Christmas Day, however long it was, 2004 or something like that. And in an instant, entire families were gone. Lives were washed away. Life changed. It was altered in a way it could never
Mm-hmm.
go back to. And people that you interact with and I interact with, some of them lost everything. They
Sure.
lost their family, their community, their identity, their career and vocation. Their entire worldview was swept away when they had that one recollection that, oh my God, I bet on the wrong
Can't do
horse
this.
here. And it was
Yeah.
my whole life. And what do I do? And so that's why I think it's so important, the service you do with your podcast and I do with my podcast, Conference on Religious Trauma. Now I run a support group on Tuesday nights. Also, it's free. Anybody who's recovering from religious trauma, any background, they can just fill out an application form, talk with me a little bit, because we need resources to be helping people who are having to rebuild their lives in the wake of such tremendous loss. Because it really is. It's huge loss upon loss when we lose our religious faith or when we leave it.
It's so true. And I think going back to your comment, it's the education piece. This is what I've learned over the years, and that is the research and education that I've done specifically around the cult psychology, the cult tactics, like you were mentioning, the bite model by Stephen Hassan, the other models of cult psychology. When I made that connection, I realized that these things were done to me. You can go down the list, whether it's the bite model or Dr. Robert J. Lifton's 8 markers of cult. And he talks about, this is what I love about Lifton, is that not only does he describe the concept of how these things happen to us, but he also talks about the psychological effect of each one. And when I saw that, I made the connection. I was like, okay, so even going through, like you say, being shunned at the very end, that's just a classic cult tactic. You should expect that, actually. If you're leaving a religion or a cult or a group, high control group, you're going to get shunned. So it doesn't make it less painful, but it's just one of the things that they all do. Every group, every high control group will end up shunning or disfellowshipping or excommunicating or suppressive persons, Scientology, whatever you want to call it, apostate, Jehovah's Witness, they will do that to you. So you have to expect that. And it's just one of the markers of cults. That's what they do.
Yes. And I think, so I'm thinking back to my own experience when I left Christianity, and I expected someone to make a fuss, someone to come after me. By and large, the silence was deafening. Like there was maybe one or two people who expressed concern, but it's just crickets otherwise.
Exactly.
And I think that's because they fear that apostasy might be contagious. Like, wow, she was a really strong believer. Boy, if she doesn't believe anymore, I don't want to know. I don't want to go there because I don't want my life to fall apart. So I recognize that, and I understand that, and I see myself as standing outside the doors of the church, to catch people who are kicked out or thrown out or stumble out, and they're trying to figure out what the heck happened to them. That's my place, rather than going into the church, yanking people out of pews and shaking them, saying it's a cult. That's not. That wouldn't be helpful, but I can be helpful for people who are leaving and who have left and who are interested in building a healthy secular life post religion, because it's hard to do, and we do need help with it.
Yeah, everyone's got their sort of niche, don't they? I think I'm more resonate with what you're talking about. I'm not necessarily going after Christianity or arguing against religion, full stop. I'm not going to go in there to shake people away. But a good friend of mine, David Johnson, he runs the Skeptics and Seekers podcast. And it's really fascinating because he's now got a Christian co-host. And so they will dissect Christian doctrine and theology, and they get right into the weeds, man. I mean, we used to go through and go through sermons, and sometimes I will be back on the show doing these sermons, and we'll listen to a sermon by a famous preacher. We'll stop it and comment on what the preacher said, and we're kind of going down that line, but that's not me. That's not what I'm called to do, if you want to put it that way, but I'm more resonating with you. I'm picking up the pieces after the damage has been done.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the work you're doing, highlighting politics, because it's not even just in the United States, but we do see around the world, there's been kind of a real pull towards right-wing nationalism in so many different countries. And really, things in America, in the United States, are really important for the rest of the world as well. I only wish I could vote. I'm Canadian. I can't vote in the U.S. Elections if I could. I know what I'd be doing, but all I can do here is just try and encourage people to really become aware of the issues and what's going on even behind the scenes, and vote accordingly. Vote like their lives and their rights depend on it.
Yeah, it's so true. If anyone's read the work of Jeff Charlotte, The Family or C Street, that's what started me off on this trail of researching Dominion theology about 5 or 6 years ago, because I'd never heard the term. Even though I went to seminary and Bible college, I'd never heard of it. And The Family is a scary one because they're, like you said, they're worldwide. They're not just in America, although they're big in America. They do the prayer breakfast in February, I think it is, presidential prayer breakfast. But they've got hooks in so many other countries around the world, pushing this Dominion theology, this Christian nationalist perspective. So yeah, people should be concerned about what's going on.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm looking forward to your book coming out, and then my book will be coming out. We can we can have each other on our shows again. Mutual Admiration Society. How can people best find you?
Okay, they can find me on Facebook. You can look up the Mindship Podcast Facebook page, although that might be changing soon, but we'll keep people apprised of that. But you can find me on X at Mindship 2018, and that's probably the best way to find me. Just get me on social media. You can email me through the Facebook page, or send me a DM on X, or Twitter, as it used to be called.
Excellent. And certainly people can reach out to me, and I'm happy to forward anyone your way who has extra questions. Thanks for joining me, my friend. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Janice. We'll have each other on. We'll do like you said, we'll do a mutual book launch when these books come out. That'll be fun. I'm looking forward to that.
Excellent. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in today to the Divorcing Religion podcast. You can go to my website, divorcing-religion.com, and get in touch with me through there. Take care, everyone. Bye, Clint.
Bye.